He's saying what? He's telling him he's not going to invade Britain? But he's not. Oh, they know that too. Well, why is he telling them then? Oh, he doesn't know that they don't know. Okay. I got it. Yeah, cool. Okay. February 28th, 1941. What do Moscow, Athens, and Alexandria all have in common? Well, this week, they are all worried about possible German invasions. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the British and Greeks came to an agreement about the size of the British force that would go to Greece to fight off any German invasion. The British and Americans pressured Yugoslavia to resist demands to join the Axis powers, and British and Commonwealth forces took Djelib, the gateway to the heartland of Italian Somaliland. After its fall, British commander Alan Cunningham asked for, and received, permission from above to pursue Italian General Carlo de Simone all the way to Harar, 1,600 kilometers away. Cunningham believes that such pursuit will keep a demoralized enemy demoralized. Already the evening of the 23rd, the East African 22nd Brigade has reached Modun, over 200 kilometers up the Mogadishu road. They take Brava the next day. The Nigerian Brigade takes Merka the 25th, and that evening, armored cars and light forces reach Mogadishu. In fact, according to the Abyssinian campaign from the British Ministry of Information, from 6 a.m. the 23rd, when they leave Mbungo, until 5 p.m. the 25th, when they enter Mogadishu, the Nigerian Brigade travels 443 kilometers. That is pretty impressive, especially considering they meet resistance along the way. Short but heavy fights at Modun and Merka. But just over 30 kilometers from Mogadishu, all opposition stops. That city, the capital of Italian Somaliland, has been declared an open town, so it is not bombed nor shelled, preserving the white stucco palaces. Now, while all this is happening, the 12th African Division is heading north along the Juba River, and even with supply issues is making great speed, taking Bardera the 26th, then heading east and taking Ishia Baidoa the 28th. The Italians have lost their last port on the Indian Ocean, and what forces of theirs remain are in disarray. Most of the 101st and all of the 102nd Divisions have been destroyed. All kinds of supplies in abundance have been taken by the invaders, and even just up to the fall of Mogadishu, more than 30,000 of the enemy have been captured or killed. That is East Africa. But how about the war in North Africa? I talked last week about the reorganization of the British and Commonwealth forces there, since a lot of them were being diverted to Greece to face any German attack that might happen there. Now, a few weeks ago, Philip Neame took over Cyrenaica command. Soon after that, he reported to overall Middle Eastern Theater Commander Archie Wavell that he just plain would not be able to defend the region with the forces he had left after his armies were stripped to send men to Greece. They were too dispersed and too green. Wavell did listen to him, but told Neame that he could not expect any reinforcements until at least May. But an Italian, German, or combined offensive before then was really unlikely. I mean, the Germans just started arriving with their very first troops a couple weeks ago, and the Italians were pretty well beaten. He does, however, give Neame the green light that if such an attack does come, Neame can fall back to the Jebel, whose landscape I talked about a few weeks ago, where any Axis advantage in armor or planes would be less of an advantage. They do know that the Germans are forming an armored force in Tripolitania, and Wavell is also aware that his original estimate of the force needed to hold Cyrenaica is, as Neame says, too low, but it is too late to fix that. As for supplying their army, after the Allied advance into Cyrenaica, Tobruk had started to replace Solom as the main marine supply route west from Alexandria. But since then, bad weather and German attacks, the Luftwaffe were now established on Sicily, has been messing with that. Also, Benghazi was supposed to be a big help, but that has not happened. Before the harbor had been swept for Italian mines, German air attacks had begun. Now on the 23rd, German planes sink the ships Dainty and Terror there. There is currently no anti-aircraft protection for the port, so it's impossible for a moment to build it up as a main advanced supply base. They're stuck using the over 700-kilometer coast road between Tobruk and the army at El Agheila as the main supply route. Besides reducing the value of the newly captured ports, the Luftwaffe's appearance imposed severe restrictions on the freedom of movement of British shipping in the Mediterranean. The direct sea route to the Middle East now became too dangerous for convoys, and by mining the Suez Canal, the enemy were able to delay the shipping turnaround at Suez itself. At the same time, the bombing of Malta made it impossible for the British to interfere seriously with the Axis supply routes across the Mediterranean. And in February and March, the enemy forces in North Africa received 200,000 tons of supplies, only 20,000 tons being lost as a result of British attacks on their ships and aircraft. For the Allies, just maintaining their forces is a real headache, because it's one thing to have that long coastal road as main supply route, and it's another to have enough vehicles to actually use it. And Nîmes has a serious vehicle shortage, so he has to change his tactical disposition. There are good defensive positions to the west of El Agheila, but they're too far from supply points for any use. And without vehicles to get supplies from afar, the armor has to rely on fixed point supply dumps at places like Mechili and Martuba, which takes away the armor's mobility. The general plan, in case of attack, is to withdraw the Australian 9th Division along the coast road while the armor waits in Antalat to see from which direction an attack will come. Of course, these preparations may well be superfluous, since such an attack is highly unlikely. The German force forming in Tripolitania under Rommel should not be in position to attack for several months at least. It's not just in North Africa, though, where there are concerns over a possible German attack. On the 25th, Georgy Zhukov, Soviet Red Army Chief of Staff, issues a secret directive calling Germany a probable enemy, and he tells the border regions to make appropriate preparations. The next day, the Soviet Baltic Fleet gets assignments in case of war with Germany. Mines and minefields are a big part of such preparations. However, they happen to have a shortage of mines at the moment. This is part of 2 days of Moscow staff talks. They decide to organize 20 new mechanized army corps for such defenses, as well as loads of new Air Force regiments with new planes. Thing is, as I mentioned last week about General Pavlov's request for more roads in the western border regions, the problem with Army or Air Force expansion is also a lack of all sorts of materials. And for the Air Force, Martin Gilbert points out that they don't have the ground facilities for new planes anyhow. Germany is making recon flights over the Baltic daily, and Adolf Hitler tells the Soviets this is designed to lull the British into thinking that they are not the next to be invaded. But Soviet intel knows that an attack on Britain has been postponed indefinitely, so Moscow is aware of danger. And we are well aware that Hitler is planning a huge attack on the Soviet Union for later in the spring. And here is a note to end this 6-day week to end this month. I have not had time to mention him lately, but February has been a very busy time for François Darlan. The French admiral and leader of the French fleet has become a well-trusted associate of French leader Philippe Pétain by now. And this month he becomes Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Interior Minister, and Defense Minister, which pretty much makes him the head of the Vichy French government. So that's the week. Big advances on 2 fronts in Italian Somaliland, and ever more worries in North Africa and Moscow. I'm going to end today by looking to Southeastern Europe, though. Bulgaria has been a bit nervous the past few months. Hitler tried to get Tsar Boris to join the tripartite pact and become an Axis power back in November, but that didn't work. Hitler also discussed with him possible Bulgarian participation for an attack on Greece. Boris pointed out that with the weather and the poor road conditions in general on the Greco-Bulgarian border, such an attack by anybody could not happen until at least March, and he firmly insisted that Bulgaria could not in any open way be involved in German preparations until just before the attack. Bulgaria was really hesitant in general during the talks, partly because of fear of Turkish intervention if Germany attacked Greece, and partly because Bulgaria had rejected the Soviet Union's offer to send in a military mission. And they were worried that if Germany's military presence in Bulgaria became known, the Soviets might retaliate by taking the Black Sea port of Varna. So, they've insisted that all preparations the Germans make must be done in utmost top secrecy, and that Germany must supply Bulgaria with all sorts of weapons and equipment to beef up the coastal defenses. Modern artillery, AA batteries, mines, naval experts, things like that. Hitler said, sure, and sent in a military mission disguised as civilians. They reported that with the poor roads, limited fuel and provisions locally available, unreliable maps and all, that operations launched in cold and wet seasons in the region had major difficulties, but not insurmountable ones. And since the weather and logistical conditions were known by all to be so bad, it would be all the easier to camouflage Operation Marita, the attack on Greece, since no one would guess the Germans would do it. So the first thing the Germans did was send in technical experts in secret to supervise road and bridge improvements made with local labor. In January, the Luftwaffe brought in 3 signal companies in civilian clothes as a warning net to monitor British aerial operations in Greece. But rumors spread. And when the Greek minister in Berlin asked at the foreign ministry if German troops were, as he'd heard, entering Bulgaria, Bulgaria made an official denial. Then the Germans told the Soviets they were sending troops to Romania. The Soviets filed a protest over this and furthermore said sending military units into Bulgarian territory would be considered a threat to Soviet security. Hitler then ordered all preparations for bridge building across the Danube from Romania to Bulgaria to be discontinued. Hitler stated that 3 objectives were to be attained by the strategic concentration of German forces in Romania. First, an attack was to be launched against Greece so as to prevent the British from gaining a foothold in the country. Second, Bulgaria was to be protected against an attack by the Soviet Union and Turkey. Third, the inviolability of Romanian territory would have to be guaranteed by the presence of German forces. It was therefore necessary to employ very strong forces, whose assembly would take considerable time. Precautions had to be taken that the German plans would not be revealed prematurely. For this reason, the crossing of the Danube would have to be delayed as long as possible. And once it was executed, the attack on Greece would have to be launched at the earliest moment. The lower Danube River makes up most of the border between Bulgaria and Romania, and it is a mighty river, Europe's second longest after the Volga. To send forces en masse into Bulgaria, bridges would have to be built. You would not really be able to keep that a secret. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because at 7 a.m. on February 28th, bridge construction across the Danube begins. Exciting stuff, huh? I mean, what in the world is going to happen? But you know, Joseph Stalin might have a lack of materials, but it is not really from lack of trying. If you'd like to see our Between Two Wars episode about his 5-year plan, you can click right here for that. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Laffy Herring. From Houston, Texas, actually. The Time Ghost Army is what finances all of our content, and now also helps to choose our new series and our mini-series. So please join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Every dollar really does lead to more and better productions. Now, I know some of you World War II equipment enthusiasts might be looking at some of the planes and things that we have on the set. It does change. And I'm sure some have been looking at that Lancaster and thinking about when it entered service and stuff. I'm just going to say it's doing test flights right now, okay? So don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell and eat your vegetables. See you next time.